The morning sun cast long shadows across the Naval Academy's parade ground as dozens of young cadets marched in perfect formation. Their uniforms were crisp, their boots polished to a mirror shine, and their faces carried the confidence of youth mixed with the pride of serving their country. Among them was Jake Morrison, a third-year cadet who had earned a reputation as one of the sharpest minds in his class. He walked with his shoulders back and his chin high, knowing that graduation was just months away. The Academy was hosting its annual Veterans Day ceremony, an event that brought together active service members, retired officers, and decorated war heroes. For the cadets, it was a day to honor those who had served before them, but it was also a day to network and make impressions on the high-ranking officials who attended. Jake had been practicing his salute for weeks, hoping to catch the eye of Admiral Richard Harding, the Chief of Naval Operations, who was scheduled to speak at the ceremony. As the cadets assembled near the main auditorium, Jake noticed an elderly man shuffling toward the building. The man looked to be in his late 70s, with white hair that seemed too long for military standards and a slight stoop in his posture. He wore what appeared to be an old naval uniform, though it hung loosely on his thin frame. What caught Jake's attention, however, was the single patch on the man's chest. It was faded and worn, barely recognizable, and seemed oddly out of place compared to the rows of medals and ribbons that other veterans wore with pride. Jake nudged his friend Marcus, another cadet standing beside him. "Look at that guy," he whispered, nodding toward the old man. "He's wearing a uniform that looks like it's from a costume shop." Marcus squinted in the direction Jake indicated and let out a quiet laugh. "And what's with that patch? Looks like something you'd find at a thrift store. Maybe he's not even a real veteran." A few other cadets nearby overheard the conversation and turned to look. Sarah Chen, a competitive cadet who often went head-to-head with Jake for top honors, smirked. Maybe he bought the uniform online. Some people just want attention, even if they didn't earn it. The group of cadets continued to whisper among themselves, their comments growing bolder as they convinced themselves that the old man was probably just someone trying to sneak into the ceremony. After all, they reasoned, any real veteran would have medals to display, not just a single mysterious patch that looked like it had been through a washing machine too many times. The old man seemed oblivious to the stares and whispers. He moved slowly, pausing occasionally, as if his legs weren't quite cooperating with his intentions. When he reached the auditorium steps, he gripped the railing tightly and began the careful climb up. Jake watched with a mixture of amusement and disdain. He had worked so hard to get where he was, spending countless hours studying navigation, military strategy, and leadership principles. It bothered him to think that someone might be pretending to be a veteran just to get free food and a good seat at the ceremony. "Should we say something?" Marcus asked quietly. "I mean, there's security here. They should check him out." Before Jake could respond, one of the instructors, Lieutenant Commander Phillips, approached the group. "Cadets, fall in line. The ceremony begins in 10 minutes, and I expect you all to represent this academy with honor and discipline." The cadets quickly straightened up and followed the instructor toward their designated seating area. Jake took one last glance at the old man, who had finally made it to the top of the steps and was disappearing through the auditorium doors. A small part of Jake felt guilty about the mocking comments, but he pushed the feeling aside. The military was about standards and earning your place, he told himself. If the old man really had served, he would have the ribbons and medals to prove it. Inside the auditorium, the atmosphere was formal and respectful. The walls were decorated with naval flags and historical photographs of famous battles and ships. Rows of chairs faced a large stage where a podium stood, flanked by the American flag and the Navy flag. Veterans of various ages filled many of the seats, some in wheelchairs, others standing tall despite their advanced years. Their chests were decorated with the colorful evidence of their service, rows upon rows of medals that told stories of bravery, sacrifice, and dedication. Jake and his fellow cadets took their seats in a section reserved for academy students. From his position, Jake could see the old man sitting alone near the back of the auditorium. The man's posture was still slightly bent, and his eyes seemed fixed on the stage with an intensity that surprised Jake. There was something in the old man's expression, a mixture of sadness and pride, that made Jake feel slightly uncomfortable. He pushed the thought away and focused on the program in his lap. The ceremony began with the national anthem, and everyone rose to their feet. Jake sang along, his voice joining hundreds of others in the familiar words. When the anthem ended, the Academy's commandant took the podium and welcomed everyone to the event. He spoke about the importance of remembering those who had served, of learning from their experiences, and of carrying forward the values they had fought to protect. After the commandant's opening remarks, several veterans were invited to the stage to share their stories. An elderly woman who had served as a nurse during the Vietnam War spoke about the wounded soldiers she had cared for and the friends she had lost. A middle-aged man who had been a Navy SEAL described a dangerous rescue mission that had earned him a Silver Star. Each story was met with respectful applause, and Jake found himself genuinely moved by their accounts. During a brief intermission, Jake stood up to stretch his legs. He noticed some of the other cadets had gathered near the refreshment table, still whispering and glancing toward the old man in the back. Jake walked over to join them, curiosity getting the better of him. "I still think something's off about that guy," Sarah said quietly, sipping from a cup of punch. "Everyone else here has at least a few medals. He's just got that weird patch." Another cadet, David, nodded in agreement. "Maybe he was discharged dishonorably or something. That would explain why he doesn't have any medals to show off." Jake listened to the conversation but didn't add anything this time. His earlier confidence about judging the old man was starting to waver. There was something about the way the man carried himself, despite his age and apparent frailty, that suggested a deeper story. The patch on his chest might have been faded and worn, but it was positioned with care, as if it meant something significant to him. The lights in the auditorium dimmed slightly, signaling that the ceremony was about to resume. Jake and the other cadets hurried back to their seats. The commandant returned to the podium and announced that they were honored to have Admiral Richard Harding in attendance. The mention of the Admiral's name sent a ripple of excitement through the cadets section. Admiral Harding was a legend in the Navy, known for his strategic brilliance and his demanding standards. He had commanded carrier strike groups, served as a diplomat in tense international situations, and was widely respected across all branches of the military. Admiral Harding walked onto the stage, and the entire auditorium rose in a standing ovation. He was in his early 60s, tall and imposing, with gray hair cut in a precise military style. His uniform was immaculate, and his chest displayed an impressive array of medals and ribbons that represented decades of distinguished service. He smiled and waved at the crowd before taking his place at the podium. "Please be seated," the Admiral said, his voice strong and commanding. The audience settled back into their chairs, and Jake leaned forward, not wanting to miss a single word. Admiral Harding began his speech by thanking the Academy for hosting the ceremony and expressing his gratitude to all the veterans in attendance. He spoke about the importance of service, about the sacrifices that military families make, and about the responsibility that comes with wearing the uniform. His words were powerful and eloquent, and Jake found himself hanging on every sentence. Then the Admiral's tone shifted slightly, becoming more personal. "You know," he said, "there are moments in every officer's career that define who they become, moments that test not just your skills, but your character. For me, one of those moments came very early in my training, and it involved a man who taught me what it truly means to be a leader." Jake's attention sharpened. Stories from Admiral Harding's personal experience were rare, and he didn't want to miss this. The Admiral continued, "When I was a young officer, fresh out of the academy and full of confidence, I thought I knew everything there was to know about being in the Navy. I had studied the tactics, learned the procedures, and graduated near the top of my class. But knowledge and wisdom are two very different things, and I was about to learn that lesson in a way I would never forget." The auditorium was completely silent now, every person focused on the Admiral's words. Jake noticed that several of the older veterans were nodding, as if they understood exactly what he was talking about. "I was assigned to a destroyer for my first deployment," Admiral Harding said, "and on that ship was a senior enlisted man who didn't fit the mold of what I expected. He was older than most of the crew, quiet, and he didn't have the chest full of medals that I thought every experienced sailor should have. In my arrogance, I almost dismissed him. I almost made the mistake of judging him by appearances rather than by his actions and his knowledge." Jake felt a strange sensation in his chest, a tightening that made it hard to breathe. He glanced toward the back of the auditorium where the old man sat, and for the first time, he noticed that several of the high-ranking officers in attendance had also turned their heads in that direction. Admiral Harding's voice grew softer but more intense. That man became my mentor, my teacher, and ultimately, one of the most important influences in my entire career. He taught me about navigation in a way that no textbook ever could. He taught me about leadership by showing me how to earn respect rather than demand it. And he taught me about humility by demonstrating that true strength doesn't need to announce itself with decorations and fanfare. The Admiral paused, his eyes scanning the audience. I learned that the most valuable lessons often come from the most unexpected sources. And I learned never to judge a person's worth by what they wear on their chest, but by what they carry in their heart and in their mind. Jake's heart was pounding now. The coincidence was too great to ignore. He turned fully in his seat to look at the old man in the back, and this time, he saw what he had missed before. The old man wasn't looking at the stage anymore. He was looking down at his hands, which were folded in his lap, and there was a slight smile on his face. It was the smile of someone who was remembering something precious. Something that had happened a long time ago but still mattered deeply. Admiral Harding took a deep breath and continued his speech, his eyes now clearly focused on a specific spot in the back of the auditorium. That man's name is Walter Briggs, and he's here today. The entire room seemed to shift at once. Hundreds of heads turned toward the back where the old man sat. Jake felt his stomach drop as the realization hit him like a physical blow. The old man with the single faded patch, the man he and his fellow cadets had mocked and dismissed, was the very person Admiral Harding was honoring in his speech. Admiral Harding stepped away from the podium and gestured toward Walter. Chief Petty Officer Walter Briggs served in the Navy for 32 years. He was one of the finest navigators the fleet has ever known, and he trained countless young officers, including me. Walt, would you please stand so everyone can see the man who shaped so many of our careers? Walter slowly rose to his feet, using the chair in front of him for support. The movement was careful and deliberate, and Jake could see now that the old man's hands were shaking slightly. Whether from age or emotion, he couldn't tell. As Walter stood, the entire auditorium erupted in applause. Veterans who had been sitting down struggled to their feet. Officers in full-dress uniforms saluted. Even the cadets, who moments before had been whispering jokes about the old man, joined in the standing ovation. Jake felt his face burning with shame. He applauded mechanically, his mind racing through every cruel comment he had made, every dismissive glance he had thrown in Walter's direction. Beside him, Marcus had gone pale, and Sarah looked like she wanted to disappear into her seat. The weight of their judgment, so casually delivered, now pressed down on all of them with crushing force. Admiral Harding waited for the applause to die down before continuing. "I want to tell you all a story about Chief Briggs," he said, his voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there earlier. "When I first reported to my ship, I thought I was ready for anything. I had excellent grades, strong recommendations, and enough confidence to fill the Pacific Ocean. But on my third day aboard, we encountered a storm that wasn't supposed to be where it was. The weather reports had missed it, and suddenly we were facing 15-foot swells and winds that were pushing us off course." Jake leaned forward, completely absorbed now. The auditorium was so quiet that he could hear the slight hum of the ventilation system. "I was on the bridge, trying to calculate our position, and I was making mistakes," Admiral Harding admitted. "I was so focused on doing things the way I had been taught in the classroom that I wasn't adapting to the real-world situation in front of me." That's when Chief Briggs stepped in. He didn't embarrass me in front of the crew, he didn't raise his voice or make me feel like an idiot, even though I probably deserved it. Instead, he quietly showed me a different approach, one that took into account the actual conditions we were facing, rather than the theoretical ones I had memorized. The Admiral smiled at the memory. He spent the next 3 hours walking me through practical navigation, teaching me tricks and techniques that you can't learn from a book. By the time the storm passed, I had learned more about seamanship than I had in 4 years at the academy, and that was just the first of many lessons Chief Briggs taught me. Walter had sat back down, but his face was visible to many in the audience now. There were tears in his eyes, though he was trying to maintain his composure. Jake could see that the old man was deeply moved by the Admiral's words. and the sight made Jake's shame even more acute. Admiral Harding walked to the front edge of the stage, addressing the audience more directly now. Over the years, Chief Briggs trained me and dozens of other officers in the art of navigation and leadership. He had a gift for seeing potential in people and bringing it out. He never sought recognition for his work. In fact, he turned down several commendations because he felt he was just doing his job. The patch you see on his uniform today is from his first assignment, serving on a destroyer during some of the most dangerous maritime operations of the Cold War. He kept that patch all these years as a reminder of where he started and the sailors he served with. Jake felt sick. The patch that he and the others had mocked was actually a symbol of authentic service, a personal memorial to Walter's shipmates and his earliest days in the Navy. While other veterans wore medals they had earned, Walter had chosen to wear something that represented his humility and his connection to his fellow sailors. Chief Briggs retired from active duty 20 years ago, Admiral Harding continued, but his influence continues through every officer he trained, and through the officers we have trained in turn. The principles he taught me about leadership, about integrity, and about putting the mission and your people above personal glory, those are principles I've carried throughout my entire career. And I know I'm not alone. There are at least a dozen flag officers currently serving who were directly trained by Chief Briggs, and countless others who were influenced by his teachings indirectly. The Admiral paused and looked directly at the section where the cadets were sitting. Jake felt the Admiral's gaze sweep across them, and he wanted to sink into the floor. To the young men and women who are just beginning their military careers, I want to share something important with you. In your journey, you will meet people who don't look like what you expect a hero to look like. You'll encounter mentors who don't fit the Hollywood image of a decorated warrior. Some of the most important lessons you learn will come from people who seem ordinary at first glance. Jake heard someone sniff beside him and realized that Sarah was crying quietly. The realization of how badly they had misjudged Walter Briggs was hitting all of the cadets hard. Admiral Harding's voice grew firmer. Never judge a person's value by their appearance or by what decorations they wear. Real leadership, real courage, and real wisdom often come in humble packages. Chief Briggs could have spent his career chasing medals and promotions. Instead, he chose to focus on training the next generation, on passing along his knowledge, and on serving with quiet excellence. That choice made him more valuable to the Navy than a dozen officers who only cared about their own advancement. The Admiral returned to the podium and picked up a small wooden box that had been placed there earlier. Chief Briggs, I know you're going to protest this, just like you've protested every other recognition you've received. But I'm asking you to accept this honor, not for yourself, but for all the quiet professionals who serve without seeking glory. Walter slowly stood again as Admiral Harding opened the box and removed a medal. Jake recognized it immediately as the Distinguished Service Medal, one of the highest awards that could be given for exceptionally meritorious service. The Admiral descended from the stage and walked up the aisle toward Walter. The cameras that had been documenting the ceremony followed him, and the audience watched in reverent silence. When Admiral Harding reached Walter, the two men stood face to face for a moment. Then the Admiral carefully pinned the medal to Walter's uniform, right next to the faded patch that had caused so much misunderstanding earlier. After securing the medal, Admiral Harding did something unexpected. He rendered a crisp salute to the old chief, holding it until Walter, clearly emotional, returned the salute with a trembling hand. Then Admiral Harding did something even more surprising. He embraced Walter in a tight hug, and the two men stood there for a long moment while the auditorium erupted in applause once again. Jake could see both men's shoulders shaking, and he realized they were both crying. The sight of these two warriors, one at the height of his career and one in the twilight of his life, sharing that moment of genuine emotion broke through Jake's defenses completely. Tears began streaming down his face, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. When Admiral Harding and Walter finally separated, the Admiral helped guide the old man back to his seat. Before returning to the stage, Admiral Harding bent down and said something directly into Walter's ear. Walter nodded and smiled, wiping at his eyes with a handkerchief he had pulled from his pocket. The Admiral returned to the podium to complete his speech, but Jake barely heard the rest of it. His mind was consumed with shame and regret. How could he have been so foolish? How could he have judged someone so superficially when everything he had been taught at the academy emphasized looking deeper, thinking critically, and respecting those who had served before? When the ceremony finally concluded, the audience began to file out of the auditorium. Jake remained in his seat, unable to move. Marcus and Sarah sat beside him, equally frozen. Around them, other cadets were quietly discussing what had happened, their earlier confidence replaced by chastened expressions. Lieutenant Commander Phillips approached their section, his face stern. Cadets Morrison, Chen, Williams, and Reynolds remain seated. The rest of you are dismissed. Jake's heart sank even further. The four of them had been the most vocal in their mockery of Walter, and apparently someone had noticed. He watched as the other cadets filed out, some throwing sympathetic glances over their shoulders. When the auditorium was nearly empty, Lieutenant Commander Phillips stood in front of the four cadets with his arms crossed. "I'm extremely disappointed in all of you," he said quietly. "Your behavior before the ceremony was unbecoming of naval officers. You demonstrated poor judgment, a lack of respect, and a failure to live up to the values this academy teaches." Jake opened his mouth to apologize, but Phillips held up his hand. "I don't want to hear excuses. What I want is for you to think very carefully about what you witnessed today. You're going to write a detailed reflection on this experience, and you're going to present it to your class next week. But before that, you're going to do something else." Phillips turned and gestured toward the back of the auditorium. Walter Briggs was still there, talking quietly with a small group of elderly veterans who had gathered around him. "You're going to go over there, and you're going to apologize to Chief Briggs. You're going to tell him exactly what you said about him, and you're going to accept whatever response he gives you. Do you understand?" All four cadets nodded, their faces pale. Jake felt a fresh wave of dread wash over him. Apologizing was necessary. He knew that. But the thought of facing Walter Briggs after everything they had said was terrifying. Jake stood up slowly, his legs feeling weak beneath him. Marcus, Sarah, and David followed suit, and the four of them walked down the aisle toward the group of veterans at the back of the auditorium. With each step, Jake tried to figure out what he would say, how he could possibly apologize for his arrogance and disrespect. No words seemed adequate. As they approached, one of the veterans noticed them coming and tapped Walter on the shoulder, pointing in their direction. Walter turned, and Jake found himself looking into the old man's eyes for the first time. They were blue and clear, and despite his age, there was a sharpness to them that suggested a mind still fully engaged with the world. Walter's expression was curious, rather than hostile, which somehow made Jake feel worse. Lieutenant Commander Phillips had followed them and now stood slightly behind the cadets. "Chief Briggs," he said formally, "these cadets have something they need to say to you." Walter looked at the four young people standing before him and then at Phillips. A slight smile crossed his weathered face. "Is this about the comments they made before the ceremony?" he asked, his voice surprisingly strong despite his age. Jake felt his stomach drop even further. Walter had heard their mockery. Of course he had. They hadn't been nearly as quiet as they thought. Phillips nodded stiffly. "Yes, Chief, it is." Walter waved his hand dismissively. "Oh, I wouldn't worry too much about that. I've heard worse in my time." He looked at Jake and the others with an expression that was almost amused. "You kids thought I was a fraud, didn't you? Some old guy trying to pretend he was something he wasn't?" Jake forced himself to speak, even though his throat felt tight. "Sir, I'm Cadet Morrison, and I want to apologize. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance, and I said things that were disrespectful and completely wrong. I'm sorry." The other three cadets quickly added their own apologies, their voices shaking with emotion. Sarah was crying again, and Marcus couldn't seem to look Walter in the eye. Walter listened to each apology carefully, nodding as they spoke. When they had finished, he gestured to the empty seats nearby. "Sit down for a minute," he said. "I want to tell you something." The cadets sat, and Walter eased himself into a chair facing them. Lieutenant Commander Phillips moved to leave, but Walter stopped him. "You might want to hear this too, Commander. Could be useful for your teaching." Phillips nodded and took a seat slightly apart from the group. The other veterans who had been talking with Walter quietly moved away, giving them space. Walter leaned back in his chair and looked at each cadet in turn. "When I was about your age," he began, "I was the biggest hothead you could imagine. I thought I knew everything, and I had no patience for people who didn't do things the way I thought they should be done. I made snap judgments about people all the time, and most of those judgments were wrong." He paused and touched the faded patch on his uniform. "This patch is from my first ship, the USS Henderson. I was assigned there right out of boot camp, cocky as hell, and ready to show everyone how smart I was. There was a guy on that ship, an old boatswain's mate named Eddie Morrow. Eddie was in his 50s, which seemed ancient to me at the time. He had arthritis, he moved slowly, and he never talked much. I thought he was washed up, just counting down the days to retirement." Walter smiled at the memory. "One night we were doing underway replenishment in heavy seas. If you don't know what that is, it means we were taking on fuel and supplies from another ship while both ships were moving, and the ocean was throwing us around like toys. It's dangerous work, and everything has to be done perfectly or people can get killed." Jake leaned forward, captivated despite his shame. "I was assigned to help with the operation, and I was trying to do everything by the book," Walter continued. "But the conditions were so rough that the procedures I had memorized weren't working. I was getting frustrated and starting to panic, which is the worst thing you can do in that situation. That's when Eddie stepped in. Without saying a word, he showed me how to read the movement of the ships, how to anticipate the swells, and how to adjust my timing to match the actual conditions rather than the theoretical ones." Walter's eyes grew distant, remembering. "Eddie saved my life that night. A coupling broke loose, and if I had been standing where I was supposed to be, according to the procedures, it would have taken my head off. But Eddie had positioned me differently, in a safer spot that still allowed me to do my job. He knew from experience that the official position was dangerous in those particular conditions." The old man looked at Jake directly. "After that night, I started paying attention to Eddie. I realized that his silence wasn't because he had nothing to say. It was because he was always watching, always thinking, always learning. He had forgotten more about seamanship than I would ever know. And I had almost missed the chance to learn from him because I judged him by his appearance and his age." Walter reached up and touched the new medal that Admiral Harding had pinned to his chest. "Eddie died 3 months after that night. Heart attack while we were in port. I never got to thank him properly for what he taught me, or for saving my life. That's why I've kept this patch all these years. It reminds me of Eddie and of the lesson he taught me about humility and respect." Sarah wiped her eyes and asked in a small voice, "Is that why you never wore all your medals? To remember him?" Walter shook his head. "Not exactly. I did earn some medals over the years, but I never felt comfortable wearing them. Every medal I received was for doing things that other sailors helped me accomplish. It felt wrong to take credit with decorations when the real heroes were the men and women I served with, most of whom never got recognized. So I chose to wear Eddie's patch instead, as a reminder that the best parts of my service were about learning from others and passing that knowledge forward." Marcus finally found the courage to look at Walter. "Sir, how can you be so understanding about what we said? We were incredibly disrespectful." Walter chuckled, a sound that was surprisingly warm. "Son, I've been around long enough to know that young people make mistakes. That's how you learn. The question isn't whether you make mistakes. It's what you do after you realize you've made them. You four came over here to apologize, which takes courage. You're sitting here listening to an old man's stories instead of running away, which takes humility. That tells me you're going to be okay." He leaned forward slightly, his expression becoming more serious. "But I want you to remember this feeling, this shame and regret you're experiencing right now. Not to punish yourselves, but to let it change how you see people going forward. In your careers, you're going to meet a lot of people who don't fit your expectations. Sailors who have tattoos and rough language but hearts of gold. Officers who seem weak but have courage you can't imagine. Civilians who appear ordinary but carry wisdom that can save lives." Walter pointed at the medal on his chest. "Admiral Harding gave me this award, but the truth is, I was just doing my job. The real award is knowing that officers like him turned out well, that they learned something from me that helped them serve better. That's worth more than any medal." Lieutenant Commander Phillips spoke up. "Chief Briggs, If you don't mind my asking, why did you come today? I know the ceremony invited all veterans, but given your preference for privacy, I'm surprised you attended. Walter smiled sadly. I came because Richard, Admiral Harding, asked me to. He called me personally and said it would mean a lot to him if I was here. How could I say no to that? He also told me he was going to talk about our time together, and he warned me there might be some recognition involved. I tried to talk him out of it, but you know how stubborn flag officers can be. This brought a small laugh from everyone, breaking some of the tension. Walter looked at Jake again. You asked how I could be understanding about your comments. The truth is, what you said about me doesn't define who I am. I know what I did in my career. I know the lives I touched and the service I gave. Your opinion of me, formed in ignorance, doesn't change any of that, but your opinion of yourself, that's what matters. You have to live with the person you see in the mirror every day. Make sure that person is someone you can respect. Jake felt tears welling up again. Sir, I want to be better than I was today. I want to be the kind of officer who sees people the way you do, who looks deeper than appearances. Then you will be, Walter said simply. Wanting to change is the first step. The second step is doing the work, every single day, to make better choices. It's not easy, and you'll still make mistakes. But each time you choose to look deeper, to withhold judgment, to give people the benefit of the doubt, you become a little bit better. Sarah asked, will you tell us more about your service, about the lessons you learned? I know we don't deserve it after what we did, but I really want to learn from you. Walter looked at her thoughtfully. I appreciate that, young lady. But I'm an old man, and I tire easily these days. However, I'll tell you what. If you're serious about learning, there are books about naval history, memoirs from sailors who served with distinction, and documentaries about the Navy's role in various conflicts. Study those. Talk to veterans whenever you get the chance. And most importantly, listen to the enlisted sailors you'll serve with when you become officers. They have knowledge that you won't find in any classroom. He paused and then added, and if you ever have specific questions, Commander Phillips knows how to reach me. I'm always happy to help young officers who genuinely want to learn. Phillips nodded. I'll make sure they have your contact information, Chief. Walter slowly stood up, and the cadets immediately jumped to their feet. The old man extended his hand to each of them in turn. When he shook Jake's hand, he held it for a moment and said quietly, You're going to be a good officer, son. I can see it in you. Just remember what you learned today, and you'll do fine. Jake nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. As Walter released his hand and turned to leave, Jake suddenly remembered something. Sir, wait, may I ask one more question? Walter turned back. Of course. The patch you wear, from the USS Henderson. Admiral Harding said you served during dangerous Cold War operations. Can you tell us anything about that? Walter's expression became more guarded. Some of what we did is still classified, even after all these years. But I can tell you that we spent a lot of time in waters where we weren't exactly welcome, keeping track of Soviet submarines and surface vessels. It was tense work, and there were moments when we came very close to incidents that could have escalated into something much worse. He touched the patch again. We had a saying on that ship, silent service, silent sacrifice. We couldn't talk about what we did, couldn't share it with our families, couldn't seek recognition for it. We just did the job and trusted that it mattered. Years later, when the Cold War ended without turning hot, I realized that our work had mattered. We helped keep the peace, even though nobody knew about it. David, who had been quiet during most of the conversation, spoke up. That must have been incredibly difficult, serving without recognition or being able to share your experiences. Walter nodded. It was. But it was also an honor. Not everything that matters happens in the spotlight. Some of the most important work is done in the shadows by people who will never get credit for it. That's true in the military, and it's true in life. He looked at all 4 cadets one more time. Remember that when you're making decisions in your careers. Sometimes, the right choice is the one that nobody will notice or appreciate. Make it anyway. With that, Walter gave them a small wave and slowly made his way toward the exit. Admiral Harding had returned from speaking with some other officials and met Walter at the door. The 2 men talked for a moment, and then the Admiral personally escorted Walter out of the building. Lieutenant Commander Phillips stood and faced the 4 cadets. I hope you understand now why your behavior was so problematic. Chief Briggs is exactly the kind of veteran we should honor and learn from. And you almost missed that opportunity because of your prejudgment. Jake nodded. Sir, I understand completely. I'm going to make sure I never make that mistake again. Phillips's expression softened slightly. Good. Now, about those reflection papers I mentioned. I want 5,000 words from each of you on what you learned today, due next Monday, and you will be presenting your reflections to the entire cadet corps, so make them meaningful. The 4 cadets groaned inwardly but knew they deserved the assignment. As they left the auditorium, Jake paused at the doorway and looked back at the empty room. The flags were still hanging, the photographs of naval history still lined the walls, and the podium where Admiral Harding had spoken still stood on the stage. But everything looked different to Jake now. He had entered this building a few hours ago with confidence and pride, thinking he understood what it meant to be a naval officer. He was leaving with humility and a much deeper understanding of true service. Over the next few days, Jake threw himself into researching and writing his reflection paper. He read everything he could find about the Cold War naval operations, about the unsung heroes who had served in various conflicts, and about the principles of leadership that emphasized character over credentials. He interviewed several enlisted sailors at the academy, asking them about their experiences and what they wished officers understood better. When Monday came, Jake stood before the assembled cadet corps and delivered his reflection. He didn't hold back, openly admitting his arrogance and the cruel comments he had made about Walter Briggs. He described the shame he had felt when Admiral Harding revealed Walter's true identity and the lessons he had learned from their brief conversation afterward. I learned that real heroism doesn't always look the way we expect it to, Jake concluded. I learned that the most valuable people in any organization are often those who serve quietly, without seeking recognition. And I learned that as future officers, our most important responsibility is to look past the surface and truly see the people we're privileged to lead. The auditorium was silent when he finished. Then, slowly, the cadets began to applaud. It wasn't the polite, obligatory applause that usually followed these presentations. It was genuine appreciation for Jake's honesty and vulnerability. After the presentation, dozens of cadets approached Jake to thank him for sharing his experience. Many admitted that they too had made snap judgments about people and were inspired to be more thoughtful going forward. The commandant even pulled Jake aside to commend him for his courage in being so honest about his mistakes. 2 weeks later, Jake received an unexpected email. It was from Admiral Harding's office, and it contained an invitation. The Admiral was hosting a small dinner for some of his former mentors, and wanted to include a few current cadets who had shown promise. Jake was invited, along with Marcus, Sarah, and David. The dinner was held at a private room in an officers' club. When Jake and the others arrived, they were surprised to see not only Admiral Harding, but also 5 other flag officers, all of whom had been trained by Walter Briggs at some point in their careers. And sitting at the head of the table, looking slightly uncomfortable with all the attention, was Walter himself. The evening was magical. The officers shared stories about their time serving with or being trained by Walter, and each story revealed another layer of the old chief's character and competence. They talked about his patience, his wisdom, his ability to stay calm in crises, and his dedication to developing the next generation of naval leaders. Walter, for his part, deflected most of the praise, and instead asked the cadets about their studies and their goals for their careers. He was genuinely interested in their answers and offered thoughtful advice based on his own experiences. At the end of the evening, as people were saying their goodbyes, Walter pulled Jake aside. "I heard about your presentation," he said. "The commandant sent me a recording of it. That took real courage, admitting your mistakes in front of everyone like that." Jake smiled. "I learned from the best, sir. You taught me that making mistakes isn't the problem. It's what you do afterward that counts." Walter clasped Jake's shoulder. "You're going to do great things in the Navy, son. I'm sure of it. Just remember to stay humble, keep learning, and never forget that leadership is about service, not status." "I won't forget, sir," Jake promised. "I won't ever forget." Years later, After Jake had graduated from the academy and was serving as a junior officer on his first ship, he kept a photograph on his desk. It was from that dinner, showing him standing between Admiral Harding and Walter Briggs, all three of them smiling. Whenever Jake faced a difficult decision or was tempted to judge someone based on appearances, he would look at that photograph and remember the lesson that had changed his life. Walter Briggs passed away peacefully in his sleep 3 years after that Veterans Day ceremony. His funeral was attended by over 200 people, including a dozen admirals, countless former students, and 4 young officers who had once mocked an old man with a faded patch. Jake gave one of the eulogies, speaking about how a single encounter with Walter had transformed his understanding of service, leadership, and human dignity. In his speech, Jake shared Walter's words about silent service and silent sacrifice. He talked about the importance of looking deeper than appearances and about the value of humility. And he made a promise, both to Walter's memory and to himself, that he would spend his career trying to embody the principles that Walter had represented so completely. The Navy named a leadership training center after Walter Briggs, ensuring that future generations of officers would learn about his contributions and his character. The center's motto, chosen by Admiral Harding, was Silent Service, Lasting Impact, a tribute to Walter's belief that the most important work often happens without fanfare. Jake went on to have a distinguished career in the Navy, eventually reaching the rank of captain. Throughout his service, he made it a point to mentor junior officers and enlisted sailors, passing along the lessons he had learned from Walter. He never wore more decorations than necessary, preferring to let his actions speak louder than his ribbons and medals. And whenever someone asked him about the photograph on his desk, the one showing him with Admiral Harding and an elderly man with a faded patch, Jake would smile and tell the story. He would explain how he had once been arrogant enough to mock a true hero, and how that hero had been gracious enough to teach him what real service meant. The story became something of a legend at the Naval Academy, passed down from one class of cadets to the next. It became a reminder that appearances can be deceiving, that real heroism often wears humble clothing, and that the most important lessons in life usually come from the most unexpected sources. And every Veterans Day, someone would remember to tell the story of the cadets who mocked an old man's patch, only to discover that he was the one who had trained an admiral and shaped the future of the entire fleet.